How many of you know what this is, the picture?
Mosquito.
What mosquito? You would be pretty good. I mean, other than my lab group, it'd be pretty good. It's Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. And I thought it was a beautiful picture. I mean, weird, but there's really some great macro photographs and stuff coming out now of the biological world. And they're really beautiful. Anyway, after pondering and considering the appropriate title, how many times have you just been told, especially wives from your spouse or whatever, it's just a bug bite, it's okay. Really, well, first, appear to the person that can tell me what animal is the most deadly on Earth and has been for eons. What? No, one specific animal.
Deer.
I would argue mosquitoes. They're in the kingdom animal. They're animals. Anyway, I thought this was a great poem. Pray transfer your air attack to my husband's slothful back. Puncture him with malice keen, then perhaps he'll fix that screen. So tonight I'm going to talk about arthropod-borne diseases. Arthropod-borne infectious diseases, most of them are zoonoses. And a zoonotic disease is a disease that typically naturally occurs in animal populations, but is transmittable to humans. So diseases like, or pathogens like West Nile virus is maintained in the bird population and mosquitoes transmitted to humans. So that's a zoonosis. I weaned it back a little bit. This is the first time I've talked seriously in a bar. I wasn't sure. I tried to adapt to the venue a little bit. But really, arthropod-borne, I keep moving around, don't I? I'm sorry, that's just the way I do it. Arthropod-transmitted diseases have shaped civilizations and truly shaped history. Whether you're considering the people that have died, or where people, and we'll get into it more in a minute, where people have moved and lived, chosen to live and establish their residence, has been driven largely, to a great extent, by arthropod-borne diseases. Goes back as far as written history. From 1 Samuel in the Bible talks about emrods, basically that's buboes or swollen lymph nodes, the plague. In Weymouth, England, it's talking about plaque, is talking about when the Black Death or plague was brought into Europe. At least this was probably the second plague outbreak that wiped out Europe. 30 to 50%, you can read all kinds of different numbers. Then just in your lower left corner, there was a plague outbreak in New Orleans in 1913, 1914, and cities used to have professional rat catchers to go around and eliminate the rat population. Plague that caused the Black Death is typically maintained in a flea rat cycle. It's a zoonotic disease. And then, just because I'm not, even though plague is a disease that I'm passionate about, there's others, flea-borne, louse-borne, tick-borne. Flea-borne typhus, or endemic typhus, was a big killer and disabler during World War II, particularly in the Pacific theater. Okay. Arthropod-borne diseases also significantly influence art. And if you look at any of the art from the Renaissance period, in particular European art, there's a lot of art, paintings, sculptures, written art, reflecting the devastation of the Black Death or the plague as it moved through. I thought this was a fascinating wax sculpture. You may not be able to see it real clearly from back there. It's done in 1695. You know, in about 40 years earlier was when plague was really hitting Europe, particularly Great Britain, the hardest. Next. To indicate that, or to illustrate that, this bar chart represents the number of plague deaths as a percentage of the total deaths per year in London from 1603 to 1647. This is plague deaths. 80% of all deaths in London in 1603 were attributed to the plague. I mean, that's unbelievable how devastating a plague that could be. And you can see that it ebbs and flows or wanes and increases over time. Next. Well, life wasn't a lot better in the United States. These are maps from the 1870 census, and I don't have a pointer, but you can see for malaria, the middle map, and typhus, murine typhus, the endemic typhus, the darker red shaded areas for malaria indicate 4% mortality of all deaths from malaria. With typhus, that's 20% mortality of all mortality attributed for those regions of the country. When and where, you see malaria was a big problem. When and where was the first successful municipal eradication program for malaria? In the United States. Oh. You're right. It was Ithaca, New York in 1953. That's amazing. Next. And because I like to pick on University of Texas a little bit, this is considered the father of the University of Texas and the father of Texas medicine. You can read it yourself. But basically, in 1839, there was a lot of questions about how yellow fever might be transmitted. Was it in clothing? Was it in whatever? Well, Dr. Asheville Smith actually tasted one of the victims' black vomit, one of the yellow fever victims, and didn't get ill, and thus furthered the theory that yellow fever was likely transmitted by mosquitoes. So if you'll go to the next one, well, actually it was on the previous one, but no, one more. Yep, back, one more. There you go, perfect. Walter Reed, how many of y'all heard of Walter Reed, James Carroll, and Aristides Agramonte, Jesse Lazier? They actually, working in Cuba, actually built huts. Some were screened and some weren't screened. Some had bed linens from yellow fever, from patients that had died of yellow fever that were soiled with vomitus and feces. And they slept in them and lived in them and exposed themselves to mosquitoes. Jesse Lazier died, I believe, out of that work. But anyway, they proved some 60 years later that yellow fever was in fact transmitted by mosquitoes, which allowed them to complete, for the Panama Canal to be completed. In 1906, 81% of the employees working on the canal were hospitalized for malaria. After they came in, cleaned it up, recognized General Gorgas was involved in it. He was in charge of it, basically, and implemented sanitation. basically the 4 Ds without D. You know, he drained the swamps, cleaned up the debris, the breeding sites from mosquitoes, and eradicated the mosquitoes. So 6 years later, that 81% had dropped to 11% malarial rate. And so the Panama Canal was able to be completed. So in Texas, one of them didn't show up. But you can imagine, use your imagination. Fox and Ham. In 1922, there were 48,000 active malaria cases in Texas. 1923, there were 42,000 dengue fever cases in Texas residents. You know, until I actually went through the archives of the Department of State Health Services records on disease. Really interesting to dig into that kind of stuff, because I had no idea that much dengue fever. How many of you knew or know that we have dengue fever active in Texas right now? Pardon? Dengue fever is it's a virus. I guess a flavivirus. It's a virus that's transmitted by mosquitoes, by Aedes aegypti, the Asian tiger, yellow fever mosquito, and the Asian tiger mosquito. They also, Zika, chikungunya, are also, Zika rings everybody's bell. You've heard of it lately. Anyway, and from 1920 till 2009, there were 1,850 cases of murine or endemic typhus in Texas. It's tapered off over time. If you look at, I was going to say those charts, or line graphs, you see that a significant drop occurred in about the mid-1940s, late 1940s. Anybody speculate what happened then? Yes, sir. DDT, organophosphates and organochlorine pesticides came in and completely changed the world. Beside pesticides, well, even beyond pesticides, the mosquito is the most deadly animal in the world. What 2 things have saved more human lives than any other measure? I'd say air conditioning and window screens. and I mean, think about it. You know, and there's parts of Africa that first picture that had Helen Borne, whatever her name was, poem. That picture, I was doing a malaria project in South May in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and you know that's how recent those people in Africa. South America is a little island country off the west coast of Africa, just horribly malarious. Used to be a Portuguese colony, but they live in thatch huts. There's a lot of people in the world. If you hadn't traveled in the third world, I think it would even reinforce the idea that air conditioning and window screens have changed everything for humankind. See what happened with malaria and dengue. Do we still have malaria and dengue in the United States, in Texas? Yeah.
What is dengue right now? You said it's active.
In San Antonio, particularly San Antonio, there's typically about 12 cases every year. They're not reported as locally transmitted. If you didn't know, that's a big deal. If local transmission is reported, things happen like what happened in the neighborhoods in Miami, where Zika was being actively locally transmitted. As long as it's imported, everybody's happy. The city council and the Chamber of Commerce are thrilled as long as it's not locally transmitted. And I have a saying that I teach a class every spring on biological threats. Public health is politics, and politics is public health. And I say that because having dealt and done work in a lot of African countries in South America, Nobody wants to admit they have an infectious disease outbreak ongoing because tourism stops and trade stops. And so if you can keep your name off the active local transmission list, you're in good shape. I swore I wouldn't give up on politics, but next. Okay, so the current emerging and resurging threats, and I explained One Health a little bit. There's about 50 arthropod-transmitted pathogens or diseases that are likely to emerge in the U.S. in the next decade or so. We know that Zika virus, which we're still figuring out all the bad things associated with Zika virus. Dengue fever and dengue hemorrhagic fever have been around forever, almost. We got rid of it, and well, actually, I'm not sure if I put the slide in, but we nearly completely wiped it out by wiping out the Aedes aegypti mosquito, because it was the predominant vector in the Americas, South America and Central America. We made some changes like reduction in pesticide efficacy, and again, politics played a role, and they have boomed back since the 1981, there may be a slide in a minute about it, but 81 or 82, South America and Central America was nearly completely Aedes aegypti dengue free. Now we have all of South America all the way up to the Mexican border, and you know that the mosquitoes aren't going to cross that border. So we don't have to worry about it. Okay, and then there's the arboviral encephalitis, or the viruses transmitted by arthropods that cause encephalitis and encephalomyelitis, like West Nile neuroinvasive disease. How many of y'all know anybody in the community that's had West Nile?
Hey, if I've had more of those diseases than anybody, like in a free beer.
How many of you had?
I've had West Nile, tularemia, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and I don't know what else is in there.
Good Lord. I need to have you out for class. Yeah, get her a free beer. No, that's really something. I've had a bunch, but so encephalitis virus is transmitted by mosquitoes, and it's another devastating encephalitid that occurs here in Texas. I think the last major outbreak was in the late 1970s in this part of Texas, but they're always looming. And really, whether we're talking about just the mosquito transmitted or the flea transmitted, like plague, tularemia, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Tularemia is typically from getting infected fluids, body fluids from an infected animal, but it can also be transmitted by ticks, and it is transmitted by ticks. And it's also transmitted by biting flies. Big deer flies or horse flies can mechanically transmit it on their mouth parts. Rift Valley fever. Have any of you heard of Rift Valley fever? It occurs in the Rift Valley. It causes spontaneous abortion in cattle and camels in particular, but also sheep and goats. It's the next agro-terrorism threat. It is the agro-terrorism threat that folks are really worried about, because the same species of mosquitoes that transmit West Nile here in North Texas also can transmit Rift Valley fever. And in humans, it will cause spontaneous abortion in pregnant women. It will also cause blindness. And so it's a significant disease. My whole point with this slide is, number one, that animals are involved, both domestic livestock and feral pigs. How many of you love cute feral pigs? Not a hand. They are extremely destructive, and I'll talk about some research we're doing with them right now in my laboratory. But they have exploded population-wise, and will continue to. And we worked on a project back a decade ago, and working with the National Pork Board, and you know, the idea was, well, to shoot them all. There's not enough bullets to kill all the feral hogs. They multiply.
They are tasty.
They're what?
Tasty.
Oh, yeah, they make great. If you just get the backstory. But they do have disease, and I'll talk about that next time. Emergent resurgent pathogens, there's very little known about their epidemiology. We are mostly unable to predict their emergence. How sick they make you and how easily transmitted is not understood well, and particularly for naive populations. Just like Zika virus, you know, Zika virus didn't get into the Americas until March of 2015, and then it just blossomed in Brazil, and has now spread, you know, through South America, Central America, and I've got a slide that will show you it's likely to spread through North America as well. There's an average of about 1,500 cases of malaria annually in the United States since 1950s, and they're not all travel related. You'll hear, how many of you heard of airport malaria? It's mosquitoes actually coming in cargo at airports, getting out into the surrounding area, and only Anopheline mosquitoes transmit it. So they don't transmit anything else in our country. But anyway, next one. Kind of being hung up on zoonotic diseases and plague. I worry about prairie dogs. I thought this picture was a great summary of the whole One Health concept. There's a plague victim laying on the bed in the middle there, and you have nearly every aspect of public health and veterinary health, or One Health, involved. You've got the dog eating infected mice, and dogs, canines and felines, can both acquire Yersinia pestis infection, plague infection, from eating infected animals. You've got the physician letting blood, letting all that evil spirits out. You've got the flea and the rat. The Oriental rat is, black rat is believed and often taught to be the only reservoir, but roof rats, all kinds of rat species, as well as all kinds of flea species, can maintain and transmit the plague bacteria. Family support, herbal remedies, the patient with buboes, and the reason they call it bubonic plague in this form is because of the swollen, look at the lymph nodes in the groin. Wherever the flea bites, the lymph nodes closest to that drain that portion of the body, they become infected with the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and it grows and grows. And so the lymph nodes will swell full of bacteria until they rupture. Once they rupture, the patient becomes septicemic if they hadn't been treated. And the plague bacteria moves around in the bloodstream, and because it's a relatively large bacteria and it's a biofilm former, Ted, you know this, done on all that blood work, but it sticks in the capillaries. It's in capillaries. So a lot of septicemic plague victims, their fingertips, the tip of their nose, their ears, where there's small capillary beds, they'll all go necrotic and rot off. And then that advances into pneumonic plague, where they're actually transmitting from human to human in saliva and in coughs and sneezes. I'm sorry that one doesn't show up very well, but as of the 3rd of November, there were 4,175 active cases of Zika virus in the United States. 1,057 were in pregnant women. In the U.S. territories, there were nearly 32,000 cases, and about 2,357 were in pregnant women. The big difference is all but a few in the United States, the continental United States, were travel related. In the U.S. territories, only 1 or 2 are travel related. The vast majority are local transmission. you can see the Zika vector distribution. The blue is Aedes aegypti, or the yellow fever mosquito. And the gold green is Aedes albopictus, Asian tiger mosquito. Both of them are effective vectors. Aegypti is just a little bit better. But up until March of 2016, we thought those distributions were way further south than what they really are. Next. Chikungunya. You know, in 2015 in particular, or 2014 was chikungunya, 2015 was Ebola, 2016 is Zika. You know, there's a new one every year. Emerging diseases, resurging diseases are always coming along. Anyway, you can read the numbers yourself. This is the map I was talking about in the lower left. Prior to 1981, dengue fever was virtually gone, as was Aedes aegypti in South America and Central America. From 1981 to 2003, you can see the explosive emergence of dengue fever in the Americas, and that's because the vector is back. Tularemia, you mentioned tularemia a while ago. You can see where it occurred in 2014. Included a listing of from 2005 through 2014, the number of cases in the United States. Nobody thinks about rabbit fever anymore. That's what they call tularemia.
Rabbit Skinner's.
Pardon?
Rabbit Skinner's disease.
Yeah, and this year, if any of you go out in the country and about, we have the largest population of cottontail rabbits and jackrabbits I have ever seen, and I grew up in this country. But they're still reproducing. There's still juvenile cottontails running around. We haven't had a first freeze yet. There used to be an old saying that never eat a rabbit. I grew up with my granddad telling me, never eat rabbits until after the first freeze. And that's to kill the fleas and ticks off of them and kill off the weak ones. And it's all because of tularemia. Next slide. There are still some knowledge gaps and research opportunities. This is my lab group. No, this is. These are plague researchers during the New Orleans 1914 plague outbreak. I thought it was great. Dr. Young, from the biosafety standpoint. Anyway. But those are all rats. If you're sitting back there, you can't see. They're dissecting rats, trying to figure out what's going on with plague. I would suggest gloves. So there's factors that influence arthropod-transmitted disease outbreaks. There's physical factors like the weather, climate, topography, soils, and hydrography. The biological factors like the flora and fauna in an area. Diseases that are prevalent in an area which can influence herd immunity. And we know from the flu every season, herd immunity helps in preventing disease. That's the whole concept behind flu vaccine. Vector and reservoir host abundance, and then the social factors, population distribution and density, standard of living, housing, air conditioning and screening, window screen, and then religious and cultural norms. When we lived in Egypt, one of the big things for Ramadan was killing a calf or a camel or sheep. And our neighbor, we lived out in the community, and our neighbors for Ramadan, they would kill a sheep or a goat. I don't remember which one it was. All the kids in the neighborhood, I mean, it was a big deal. They were slaughtering an animal for the feast, for iftar. And the kids would all run over and dip their hands in the pool of blood and then put their handprints on the walls. And it was just a form of celebration, part of the big party. The Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever is exactly transmitted that way to avifauna. And I've wondered, you know, tularemia could be transmitted that way if sheep and goats had it, but Q fever, several pathogens like that. Okay. So, the whole reason, talking to the climate group, the climatic influences. Climate may and does cause changes in wildlife distribution. You can look at before the drought in 2011 through 2013, we had feral pigs up on the catwalk. They had only been up a few years, but we had well-established sounders of feral pigs. After the drought, I hadn't seen a feral pig in Lubbock County since. Seen very little evidence anyway. So they're moving around because of the change in weather patterns and vegetation food sources. Climate changes can also affect the vector population. It's just like Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus occurring so far north, in Texas, all the way up into Minnesota, all the way up into the Northeast. Now, a lot of that though has to do with an urban island concept. In Lubbock, we didn't have huge oak trees and lakes year-round and well-manicured water lawns and flower beds. Lubbock is now an island in the middle of the grass desert, or grass ocean, where we have gray squirrels, we have ticks, we have all kinds of things that never existed here naturally. So that occurs in other parts of the country as well. Excuse me. Climate changes will cause changes in human activity, where we live, how we live, and it may compromise human immunity by making us more susceptible. Like with the Dust Bowl days. How many of you read The Worst Hard Times? Fantastic book. You need to get it. It's worth reading. The map in the lower left-hand corner is the drought index in 1934. And I thought this book, The Climate in Texas, Effects of Climate and Weather Changes in Causing Diseases and Deaths. So mankind has recognized for a long time that weather and climate influence and affect their health. Just quickly going to talk about feral pigs just a minute. We've got a research project going with the Noble Foundation out of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University, looking at feral pigs and black bear, doing serology, looking at what they've been exposed to. Back a decade ago, we found 52% of the feral hogs in Crosby County were positive for Francisella tularensis tularemia. We're seeing similar things right now in North Texas and Southern Oklahoma. Brucella, that causes brucellosis or undeveloped fever in humans, 8% positive last year. You can read that for yourself, but PRRS, PRRS, is porcine respiratory and reproductive syndrome virus, found positive there. Pseudorabies virus, positives. Next one. And then right now we're working, there's a whole group of us working with Texas Department of State Health Services on Zika, chikungunya, and dengue fever. Right now we're trying to just validate where all the Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus occur. My group, what you said back there, they recognize mosquitoes in their dreams because they've looked at so many of them, but we're running overcrowds, collecting the eggs in 32 different counties in the Panhandle. The AgriLife extension agents will take out that little paper strip out of the cup that has the mosquito eggs on it, mail it to us. My crew rears them out and identifies them, and we're finding Aedes aegypti and albopictus as far north as we're looking. So we know they occur. They're all around Randall, Potter County, so we know that artificial urban environment is there, which would be a great dissertation, guys. We're going to look at that. Next. So the bottom line, Semper Venus or Bosco, which means always threatening epidemic, because infectious pathogens do not respect political boundaries. the vectors don't respect political boundaries, and really infectious disease outbreaks are just a plane ride, a train ride, a long hike away from our community, a car ride. Because neither the vector or the pathogen respect boundaries, infectious disease, particularly zoonotic diseases, are truly a global issue. It's, you know, nationalism is great, but the whole global perspective you have to consider when you're thinking about infectious diseases. Constant vigilance is required to recognize, and there's a lot of prediction. Once climatology and other things all came together, the ability to predict disease outbreaks has improved, but it's not anything like it may be in the next 10 years, especially with what we're seeing with Zika, chikungunya, and dengue in the Americas. And that's it.